As we look at this passage, this is a continuation of our passage from last week, in which we began to look at the concept of submission. Now, submission is one of those things that I think is a little bit, I don't want to say taboo, but it's definitely out of style to talk about the concept of submission. We don't really like submission all that much. For most of us in this room, actually, we probably like submission least out of anything. We are notoriously independent. We are notoriously wrapped up in the concepts of freedom. We are notoriously bound up with this idea in which we can kind of do what we want to do. All right? Now, I can tell you within 3 seconds exactly how willing you are to submit. It's a very simple test. It's a very easy test. It is a test in which every single person in this room, they will know immediately how willing they are to obey to authority and how willing they are to submit to authority. Okay? Are you guys interested in this test to find out how willing you are to submit to authority? There was some nervous laughter amongst the room. That's the first question. That's not the first question. All I need you to do, and maybe this crowd doesn't hit the same. All I need you to do today, as you go home from here, and all this week, wherever you go, drive the speed limit. That's all I need you to do. All right? All right? Now, some people I've already heard, well, it's not safe because everybody's... No. I didn't want any... all I'm saying is, you can find out how willing you are to submit and obey based on something as simple as just driving the speed limit. All right? Now, I'm not going to get into whether or not and what the theological implications of driving the speed limit and all those different things. I'm just talking about this idea of submission. However, submission is inherently different than simply obedience. We understand that, right? Submission isn't about blindly following what somebody has told you to do. Submission is built in relationship, built out of respect, built out of experience, and trust that the individual in which you are submitting to has your best interests at heart. If we simply obey something for the sake of obedience, that is not submission, that is obedience. There are, as we looked through this passage last week, where wives submit to their husbands, there is a conversation that needs to happen in that submission is a partnership. If my wife and I begin to have a conversation that you might have, and maybe you've had in your lives different times throughout your life, in which maybe there's some big decision that needs to be made. About 15 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, something like that, my wife and I began to have a conversation around the concept of church planting. We were at a fairly large church in Virginia. We had been there for about 10 years. We were very comfortable with what we were doing there. We liked what we were doing there, but God began to stir in my heart a desire to plant a church, to move, to go somewhere in which the gospel needed to grow, a place in which maybe the gospel wasn't being presented as much. We began to pray through the church planting process. Submission for me and my wife was not that I showed up one day and I said, hey, we're going to plant a church. You have to listen to me. I'm your husband. Submission in that context was the two of us together fasted and prayed and sought God and evaluated and had all the conversations at the dining room table, in the living room, on the prayer floor, everywhere, where we went back and forth and we had knockdown dragouts. We had every conversation we could possibly have about the potential of planting a church. And I remember early on, Dominique used to tell me, and she's going to hate me for this, she used to tell me, she goes, there's only 2 places I don't want to live. She said, Ohio. Sorry, guys. So, looking at my people from Ohio. All right. Ohio, and then she said St. Petersburg, Florida. She's from Tampa, so that you can tell. And then we planted a church in St. Petersburg, Florida. Which, by the way, that's a thing right there. Don't ever tell God you don't want something. because you have to pretend like it's autumn sometimes because you live in Florida. But we, through that process, had to have a very long and drawn out discussions and those different things, to where we could have all sorts of disagreements. We could go back and forth on the pros and cons and all these different things. But when it came to it, at the end of the day, as I submitted to Christ to the calling of church planting, and Dominique submitted as a wife in a marriage, all those conversations that we got together, that I heard her voice, listened to her counsel, did all those different things. But when God called us to go, there was an opportunity and there was a time in which we both had to say, okay. So we had to step into faith in God. Now, here's an interesting thing about that when we talk about this idea of submission. You might think that it's easier to be the person who is being submitted to rather than the one doing submission. You might think that. However, here's the deal. Whenever you have been granted submission by another person, that also means that you've been granted responsibility for what happens based upon the decisions you make. At the end of the day, had we come down to Florida and crashed and burned, it's my responsibility as the one who's leading the charge, and I would have been the one held responsible for the consequences of that. Which is why when Paul talks about submitting to your wife, he actually says, or when he says your wife is submitting, he says that you love your wife so that your prayers may not be hindered. There's an implication here in which responsibility falls on the leader of that. And that happens in all different areas. Husband and wife. In this passage, we see the same thing happening with children and their parents. Now, most of us in here may not have to deal with this concept of obeying our parents. There is an interesting theological conversation of at what point do you have to stop obeying your parents. There's something along the lines of when Jesus says that when you get married, you leave your father and mother and you become something new. But there is this idea here that while maybe we don't obey our parents, there is still a concept here in verse 2 where it says, but you should honor your father and mother. Now, for most of us in this room, maybe not all of our parents are still around. Maybe some of your parents are still around. I have one parent, but not another parent who's still alive. But the concept of honoring your parent doesn't stop when you get married. It doesn't even stop when your parents proceed into heaven before you. The concept of honoring your parents is a thing which exists perpetually in the fact that everything that your parents taught you, everything that your parents brought up to you, everything that they instilled in your life, all those lessons that they tried to give you, you are still about trying to be about the things your parents raised you in so that you continue to honor their legacy, their memory, who they are. Even though I don't have to sit in obedience to my parents, I still strive to honor my parents. Now, there are some in this room in which they are not married, they have not moved off on their own, and they still do need to obey their parents. There are exactly two people in this room, and I hope one of them is listening. But honoring your parents is interesting because what it says here in verse 2 is it's the first commandment with a promise. It's actually interesting when you look at Scripture. Pretty much every time there is a promise of God, there's usually a commandment associated with it. There's usually something God is expecting of you to engage in that. And the promise here that we see in the book of Exodus is it says that it'll go well with you and you will live long in the land. This idea of obeying your parents. I don't know about you, but the idea of it going well with me and living long in the land, that's something in which I really want to be a part of. But what does it mean when I say that? The idea of obeying and honoring your parents and then it going well with you, first and foremost starts off when you're a child, in which your life is smoother when you obey your parents, right? Because now all of a sudden there isn't all the consequences or all the discipline or all the other things. If you're obeying your parents, things tend to go a little bit more smoothly for you. But also, because your parents do have more experience than you, because your parents do have a little bit more wisdom than you, because your parents are growing you, there is also this idea of living long in the land, right? In which your parents are giving you the skills in which you need to successfully go about living your life, right? Most of us, if we think back to when our kids were quite young, right? If we left them to their own devices, they would not live long in the land, right? They're out there climbing trees and jumping off of, diving boards, and they're like running around to do all those different things. There's the wisdom of age in which they look at the kids and we say, hey, maybe not that, right? But there is an idea here in which we honor our parents to live long in the land. There is also an admonition here to fathers particularly of not provoking their children to anger. But I do want to say that provoking your children to anger is connected here in opposition to discipline. All right, it might be easy for us to think of this concept of provoking someone to anger is connected to discipline. Like if I were to discipline a child, it would bring them to anger. The idea here is that discipline actually is the thing you do so that you don't provoke your child to anger. Right? Inconsistency is what's going to provoke a child to anger. Discipline is actually an expression of freedom, which I know sounds really weird. But if you live in discipline, you actually experience more freedom than restriction. I'm a weird person. I know that doesn't take a lot to believe. But I do things like I read articles based upon like anthropology, and I read like social experiments. So I kind of read some of this stuff about like human condition. And I remember one time reading a very fascinating article about playgrounds. Okay, and I know you guys don't like read articles about playgrounds, but there was this article written by the sociologist, and what they did was they basically went to these different playgrounds and they examined different playgrounds and how kids interacted with the different obstacle courses and things that they had, like the swings and the little bouncy things, all that stuff, different stuff. This person was trying to make better playgrounds. So they observed these children and they noticed that these children were all kind of staying around a certain area. It was a pretty expansive playground. They had some swings over here. They had some of those little springy things that the kids go on over here. They had slides and sand pits, that kind of stuff. But all the kids kind of stayed in this one little area where it was kind of like the mulched-in area with the big climbing thing and the slides and everything. And this sociologist was wondering, like, is it just the kids like these things? Like, what's causing these kids to do this? And some of the kids, he actually would talk to the kids and say, hey, why aren't you going over the swings, or why don't you go over there? And they go, oh, well, I don't really like going over there. It's kind of uncomfortable. I don't really know what to do when I get over there, and like that. So this guy did something really interesting. He put a fence around the playground. And he put a fence that went all the way out past the things that were farther away, and put a fence around the whole playground. And then didn't say anything to the kids, didn't add anything, didn't change anything that they offered. All he did was put a fence up around the playground with one exit and one entrance. And then he put benches there where the parents were hanging out, where they could like hang out by the entrance and all those different things. And all of a sudden, when he went back to the same playground after he put up the fences, the kids were utilizing every piece of equipment in the playground. The drawing of restrictions and creating of discipline provides more opportunity for individuals and children to utilize the extent of everything being provided. In which these kids actually began to utilize pieces of equipment that weren't being utilized because now they felt comfortable, now that they knew the boundaries of where they were allowed to go. And for us, as we are in the process of helping our children, whether they are adult children or whether they are young children, we have to get to the point where we understand that discipline and instruction bring about freedom because we know where the lines are. And now we can go up to the line. He continues on in verse 5 through 9, talking about this concept of bondservants. Bondservants, and maybe your passage that you're looking at in your Bible has a different word there, but the word bondservants is an interesting word. It comes from the word doulos, but the word doulos actually has 3 to 4 different connotations of what the word possibly could be based upon where it sits in context. But this Greek word doulos, meaning that we translate bondservants, sometimes is translated as slave, as in like actually under the ownership of another human being. We see that exists sometimes in Scripture. If we look at situations maybe like in Philemon, where Paul is talking about Onesimus being his doulos, he's actually talking about slave there, and Paul actually encourages Philemon to bring Onesimus out of doulos and into doulos. Which is weird, because he says, Onesimus should no longer be doulos to you, but instead he should be doulos to you. Which sounds weird, because he's using a different word there. He says, Onesimus was slave, but now he becomes bondservant. Right? Bondservant was a position in the context of the ancient world in which individuals found themselves in service to other individuals based on a number of contributing factors. Sometimes maybe they owed a debt and they literally were bonded to somebody until they paid off that debt. Sometimes they were an individual who were a prisoner of war and they were bonded to a particular country or individual based upon their status as a prisoner of war. And other times there were individuals that chose to become bondservants because they were bonded to a particular family because that family provided for them both the things that they needed as well as protection. So if you were let's say you were an individual and you were growing up and you didn't have a lot of means, you didn't really have a lot of opportunities, you didn't have a lot of education, you could actually submit yourself to become a bondservant of another family, so that family would bring you up, educate you, give you position, like actually help you become a contributing member of the household. It's much more similar to what we would think of as, much more similar to what we would think of as do I need to go to the thingy? All right. As what we would consider an employee-employer relationship. All right. Okay. Not yet. How you guys doing? Okay? Do I need to do something? Hello? All right. All right, so the idea here that we talk about this is much closer to employer-employee relationship. This is kind of where we find ourselves today, right? That we submit ourselves to individuals. Sorry, guys. All right. We submit ourselves to individuals for the purpose of employment. Meaning that they're providing for us. They are there to give us our resources. We are able to work, and then that work brings about the fact that they pay us. They protect our jobs. They actually provide for us in a certain way. So when we look at this passage where it says that bondservants should be in submission to their masters, we can think of this in the context of employer-employee relationships, in which we are submitting ourselves to the employer for the purpose of provision, for the purpose of job security, for the purpose of protection, all those different things. And what we see here is that he gives us a couple of expectations for us as we seek to obey our bosses, our masters, our employers. And he says things like that we are doing the will of God from the heart, rendering our service with goodwill, not as simple eye service to men. I've been married we talked about this, I was right last time. I'm going to see if I'm going to be right this time. 16 years we've been married. And I don't know about you, if anybody's ever had one of those situations. I've actually heard this from my wife before, where I've done something, and she'll say, hey, can you do this thing? Like maybe it's the dishes or it's laundry or it's whatever, can you do this thing? And I'll go do the thing. I've gotten much better about it now. Well, I think I've gotten better about it. But I remember when we were younger and we were married, I would go do the thing and I would just be like, okay, fine. I'll just wash dishes. And then we'd have a conversation afterwards, and she would say something along the lines of, she was like, I know you did it, but I want you to want to do it. We don't have this conversation anymore. This isn't. But you know what I mean? Like, I want you to want to do it. This is what we're talking about when we talk about serving and doing the will of God from the heart. Rendering service with goodwill, not as simple eye service to people around you. The idea of serving in the context of obeying those in authority or leadership over you, whether that's employment, whether that's even here at the church and serving, whether that's you're serving on a committee or you're serving under a committee, whether you're just like showing up and helping out on Sunday mornings. The idea of service in relationship to true service being a service in which we render with a joyful heart in which we want to participate in the service. It's not just that I'm doing the thing, it's I want to do the thing, and I want to do the thing well, because I'm not working for my employer, I'm not working for a boss, I'm not working for, this other person. I'm working as if I'm working unto the Lord. But we can fall into a little bit of a mindset in which we kind of rest on our capacity to get the job done, and we don't necessarily think of it in the context of how do I do the job to the best of my abilities. You know what I mean? I remember when I was working at a long time ago, I used to work at Starbucks. You guys know what Starbucks is, right? Okay, just checking. And there's a very particular way they want you to make things at Starbucks. Like, there's a very particular order that you're supposed to do things and everything like that. And every once in a while, my manager at Starbucks, when they were on their break, would order a drink and then just like sit at the end of the bar, like very casually waiting for their drink to get made. And it was always interesting to me that when the manager's on the floor and you're like standing next to the manager, people tend to do a really good job. But all of a sudden, when the manager was just getting their drink, I noticed I would see people do this, where they would make the drink and the manager would say, well, why didn't you do the thing you were supposed to do? And they were like, and I heard somebody say this, they said, well, I just knew it was for you and I didn't think you would care all that much. Oh, they cared. Because they did it to see how people went when they weren't being observed. There's an idea here in which we work, not for our employer, not for our spouse, not for our friends, not for pastors, not for committee members. We work as if we are working for the Lord. And that the God of the universe watches our commitment to see how we present the sacrifice of our service. How we submit ourselves to the authority in the midst of service. Whether that's voluntary service, like helping out at the church, or whether that's employment, being at your job. So my question for you this morning is, in what areas do you need to grow in your capacity to work with a joyful heart and to work well in which God is calling you into? Maybe there's some things coming up and you say, you know what? Something come up I really don't want to do, but I know God wants me to do it. Maybe there's already something going on in your life and there's just big things happening at work or big things happening here at the church and you're like, I don't know if I can, I don't know if I don't know. What are the areas in our lives in which we need to surrender over to God so that God can bless our service as he truly wants to bless our service? As our ushers are coming up this morning, they're going to be collecting our offering. As they collect our offering, we'll have a time where we can reflect, a time in which we can look, and I'm wondering, is there something God is asking of you? Is there something God needs of you that you haven't surrendered over to him yet? Maybe you've been coming here to North Bay and you've been keeping North Bay at arm's length. And maybe your act of service and submission might be you're ready to take the next steps in membership. If you are thinking that's where you are, I want you to talk to me or Dan after service, and we can talk you through the process of what membership looks like here at North Bay. Maybe it is you've heard about some of the new ministries and things that we're starting, and God's placing something on your heart that you need to surrender over. We encourage you to let us know about those things. Maybe you want to help serve in that area. Maybe your act of service this morning is through the gift of your tithes and offerings. Offerings, giving freely of the heart, to help us with what we're doing here. Tithes, though, are an act of service and obedience. As those members of the church, there is a commitment in which we have to submit ourselves to the service of giving of our tithes over to God. And maybe for the first time in your life, you said, you know what, I've been going to church for a while, but I've never really engaged in tithing. I give here and there. And you might want to start that out this morning. And I would encourage you to give whatever you can this morning, but then talk to one of us about what tithing looks like on a continual basis and what it looks like to submit yourself into the service of tithing. And I don't know where you are this morning, but I want you to pray through that as the offering goes out this morning.